Fred knew from the start that he was marrying people out of his league, but what the hell? He and Susan had been together for over 10 years, and the Baker house was still quiet. He had a good job at Interstate Electronics. He was the senior technician that all engineers turned to when they needed someone who could bring their newest brilliant idea to life. For this, he received a salary large enough to support Susan and the twins the way they wanted, without Susan having to work. True, she had a part-time job as a realtor. She said it was just a way to fill her time while the twins were in school, and Fred was fine with that. In his opinion, nothing was too good for his wife. Sometimes, when he woke up with the blonde goddess sleeping peacefully next to him, he still had to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He kept asking himself what she even saw in a nerd like him. He had even questioned her about it before, but he soon found that he had run into a solid stone wall. He remembered this time on their first anniversary. "You know, darling," he began, quite hesitant to even bring up the subject, but he did feel that married couples should, not to say, share everything. At least they know much more about each other than they do. Oh, she knew a lot about him. He was an open book. He made no secret of the fact that he was a clumsy farm boy who got lucky and got good opportunities. Susan was only the fourth girl he'd ever dated, and one of three he'd made it to third base with. Everything he knew about sex before they got married, he learned from reading sex manuals and watching adult films. Their wedding night was far from spectacular, but with much patience and understanding, Fred gradually improved until, within a month of their wedding night, Susan was regularly experiencing pleasure, despite his inept attempts at lovemaking. By the time of their first anniversary, they both agreed that the difficult days were behind them, and they had finally settled down and become an old married couple. The only thing was that Fred wasn't as ignorant as some might think, and from time to time he would catch Susan with that vacant look in her eyes. It was one of those times, on their first anniversary, that Fred decided they needed to talk. Something was bothering Susan, and when his wife wasn't happy, he stuck to the old school that a good husband should do something about it. However, in order to do something about her problem, he had to know something about her problem, so he gritted his teeth and began to interrogate her. He joined her on the porch swing overlooking their duck lake. It was the best view for miles, or so they thought. "Darling," he began, "I never understood why you gave a second thought to a jerk like me. Why?" His question seemed to snap her out of her reverie. "What are you talking about? You're not stupid. You're the most amazing guy I've ever been with." "Wow, don't bother my head too much. I still need to put on my hat." Perhaps on this day he will receive answers. "You've had a lot to do, haven't you, since you know I'm that good?" "Not stupid. I just know quality when I see it. I told you right away that you were the first girl I ever made love to, but every time I tried to find out something about you, you went into some dark place and refused to open up. What gives? Why do you think it's important to know how many men I've dated? This in itself is not important, but do you understand that I knew almost nothing about your life before we met? Everything I know, your likes and dislikes, I had to learn through trial and error. In this regard, you did wrong, but your life before we met is like a closed door. Don't you think I deserve to just look behind those doors?" "Okay, so what do you want to know? Let's start with the simple ones. How would you describe what kind of child you were?" "It's easy. I was a spoiled child. Daddy had me wrapped around my little finger, and he was trying to give me everything I wanted." "Did he ever spank you as a child?" "No, he never did, but of course I was always his favorite and didn't need a spanking." "I think this answers my long-standing question about why your father gave me this oar as a wedding gift." "Oh yes, the famous attitude corrector. At least it's a cute conversation piece, just like you'd hang it in your kitchen. You might need this one day, son," her father said, giving him a paddle with a picture of a country father with his adult daughter or wife lying face down in his lap as he applied the attitude adjustment. Why he was stuck on this, he really couldn't say. The day her father gave it to him, he was joking, of course, but he seemed to be closer to Fred than he had ever been before or since. He put it in a prominent place where it served him, and the old man laughed heartily every time he came. She moved so that her legs were tucked under her as she swung, and she was facing Fred. A fair is a fair. If I answer questions, you must answer the same questions. Okay, but all answers must be true. I agree, with one caveat. We can refuse to answer if we think it's best for either of us. Damn, this isn't fair. You can still avoid the relevant things. Take it or leave it. At least if I refuse to answer, you'll know this is a problem area. Fred agreed, and they discussed for a long time. For his part, Fred admitted that she was his first lover and learned that she was at one time engaged. This was a surprise. She said she broke up with him when he wanted her to move to Alaska. According to her, she hated cold weather. He insisted on asking questions about her love life and learned that she had kissed her first boy when she was 12. The memories brought up by this conversation turned them both on, and they ended up having sex right on the swing. No, they weren't worried about anyone seeing them, at least not much. Their house is located in the countryside, away from the road. To get there, they had to drive half a mile down a winding, wooded road, so they would hear the engine of any car long before anyone saw them. Fred looked back fondly on the years that followed, during which they became a normal, happy family with a mortgage, 2 children, a nice car for her, and an old truck for him, everything that made up a real American family. After the twins reached high school, Susan, who was a stay-at-home mom, got a job, and the extra responsibilities at work led to changes in the Baker household, including their sex life, but it was nothing Fred couldn't handle. Until the moment came when he couldn't. It wasn't anything serious, nothing that Fred could put his finger on, but one day he realized that something was wrong. Susan was happy to God was in heaven, and everything was right in the world. So what if Fred wasn't the best lover in the world? The call came to work. Susan didn't recognize the number, but as soon as she heard that voice from her past, her heart must have started beating twice as fast. She immediately realized it was Tony. He said he went back to his parents' house and asked if they could meet for drinks or something, just as a welcome gesture since most of the old friends they hung out with had left town for better things. She refused that day, but Tony wasn't the type to give up. Finally, after weeks of daily calls, she relented and agreed to meet him for lunch. Just this once, for old time's sake. After all, I'm a married woman and I love my husband. Naturally, Tony agreed, but somehow once became once a week, and then twice a week or more. Almost from the very beginning, Tony started reminding her of the good times they had together and how they could have so much fun again if she would just meet him somewhere after work. No, are you crazy? I'm a married woman now. I love my husband and children. I'm not going to give it all up for a guy who doesn't want to be responsible. She was adamant the first time he suggested they meet after work. Oh, baby, don't hold it against me. I paid for the procedure, didn't I? Yes, but where were you in those days after the abortion? At the very time when I needed support, you were nowhere to be found. I know, and I'm sorry I was so stupid. But all I ask is just to be nostalgic over a drink and maybe dance a little. You still love to dance, don't you? Susan still refused, but he struck a nerve. She really liked dancing, and Fred didn't really like it, so it had been quite a while since she last danced, and she and Tony were good together, so good that they won several competitions. Tony changed tactics. He began to focus on continuing to have frequent lunches together. He began to insist that meeting after work was the same as having lunch together, so why shouldn't old friends meet? How could she refuse? After all, she reasoned, there was nothing wrong with old friends meeting for drinks. It didn't mean she was keeping something from Fred. So, 2 or 3 times a week, she continued to disappear for lunch, rushing to meet Tony in a small, secluded cafe. In the present tense, Fred was trying to figure out what he had done wrong, why Susan was so hot on some nights and acted like the ice queen on others. When he asked her directly about it, she denied doing it, but Fred noticed that within a few weeks of him mentioning it, things had gotten much better in the bedroom. Susan was shocked when Fred questioned their sex life or lack thereof. She didn't realize it until he put it into words, but they were truly becoming more like roommates and less like lovers. She denied it, even to herself, until she started making every effort to make sure he got as much sex as he could handle. She felt guilty about this. Fred had become a skilled lover, not quite a Don Juan, but vastly superior to the inept guy she had brought into her bed on the night of their honeymoon. And God, she was sure of his love for her and the twins. That's what made her so unhappy. It was her fault, hers. And that damn Tony's. Why did he decide to come back to town? Why couldn't she get him out of her head? She felt so low that she could walk under the belly of a snake, as her mother said. But damn it, she just couldn't stop remembering. She still had feelings for him. She couldn't do anything about it. If she were honest with herself, she would have to admit that the problems in the bedroom Fred complained about started around the time Tony showed up. She particularly remembered a night when Fred was unusually horny and tried to initiate sex as soon as they put the twins to bed. While he tried to excite her, her thoughts were about Tony and how special he made her young body back then. She was living proof that a woman never forgets her first lover, even if she hasn't touched him for years. At first, Fred was worried that she might be sick, but when she insisted that everything was fine and still couldn't get aroused after prolonged caressing, she suggested that he just get his. Then Fred got angry and went to sleep in the guest room for the first time since they got married. After she cried herself to sleep that night, Susan vowed that if she couldn't be a loving wife, she would at least pretend to be one. Fred watched his wife get dressed for work. He had to work for 2 weeks on a shift from 16 to 24, in other words, a swing shift. He always hated that damn shift. He'd be at work an hour before Susan got home. Whoever came up with this watch must have either not wanted much sex or worked with a lot of women who were giving at work. That certainly didn't describe him to Susan. She would never give it to anyone else. Hell, she'd barely given it to him lately. But there was one bright spot. By the weekend, she usually became so horny that they would send the kids to one of the parents, and he and Susan would have sex like teenagers at least for the first day. Are you dressing up like this just for work? Fred lay propped up on pillows, with the sheet pulled up to his waist. You know I can see you playing with yourself, right? Oh yes, baby, now you're doing it. I'll just give you 45 minutes to stop. My pleasure, baby, but I have to go. I don't want to be late for work. Hey, he reminded her as she walked out the door. You didn't say why you dressed up like that. Nothing much. You won't be home for dinner. The kids are at Mom's, so me and a couple of the girls are going to spend Friday night at Big John's place. Big John's place, so named because its owner, Big John, was a 4-foot dwarf who ran the most popular restaurant in the country. The food was good, the prices, including alcohol, reasonable, and there was a country band playing there on Friday and Saturday, providing music for dancing, listening, or whatever. On other nights except on Sundays, visitors had to make do with a DJ. Sundays were for church, according to Big John, and if he found out that someone didn't go to church, the price of their drinks went up by 10%. As Tennessee Ernie's song sang, everyone knew better than to cross Big John. Instead of having the size of John in the song, Big John relied on a whip and 2 bouncers to keep him out of trouble. He was so good with a whip that he could knock a fly off a wall from 8 feet. Of course, the bouncers always supported him. The place was usually crowded. Years ago, a couple of bullies caught Big John in town one night without his whip and bouncer and started beating him up when Fred intervened with a jack handle. After Fred took him to the hospital and helped him recover, Fred's money was no longer relevant in John's establishment. To say that Fred and John developed a close friendship would be an understatement. Well, enjoy. I'll be thinking about you, having fun while I work in the salt mines tonight. Say hi to John for me. Don't get into trouble, he shouted as she walked out the door. It was only when he was getting ready for work that he thought again about Susan's choice of clothing. She had gone out with girls many times, but he didn't remember her dressing up like that. Okay, let's go back to the good old salt mines, he thought. Susan was worried all the way to work. She hadn't lied to Fred exactly. She had actually been going out with the girls, and she hadn't yet responded to Tony's request to meet her one evening while Fred was working, but she had mentioned that she and the girls often spent Friday nights at Big John's. She could also mention that on Fridays there are always men and women there who love to dance, and if Tony enjoys dancing as much as before, she's sure he'll find plenty of willing partners there. She'd bet $10 that Tony would be there tonight, and she'd be lying if she said she wasn't looking forward to dancing with him again. Susan was also lying to herself, and she knew it. She kept telling herself that she had no feelings for Tony. She still had them. Not exactly feelings of love, but since he returned to the city, she often thought about him, so often that she decided to stop hiding their relationship. Mostly these thoughts revolved around one burning question to which she wanted an answer. Why did you break up with me? In all their dinners, she had never dared to ask this question, mostly because she was afraid of the truth, afraid that he had chosen another woman over her. But tonight would be different. Tonight, she was going to find out the truth. Deep down, she also asked herself why she lied to Fred. Why did she tell him she broke things off with Tony? She should have just told her husband the truth. She vowed to correct this mistake soon. "Thank God it's Friday," she exclaimed when the last buzzer sounded at 4:30. Joining the stream of her colleagues heading toward the parking lot, she checked her text messages for words from Tony. Nothing, not a word. Nothing. In fact, I haven't heard from him all day. If Tony could hear her thoughts, his ears would burn. Did he really take the day off to go fishing or something when I finally decided to introduce him to the company? Yes, I know he doesn't know about it, but that didn't stop him from bothering me every other day this week. Men, they're so. They're so. Big John's place was packed, but she and her friends were lucky enough to grab a round table in the corner. Their drinks were served, and soon their table was alive with the latest hot gossip. The five of them had already finished the food they ordered, drank their first bottle of wine, and were halfway through the second when Susan noticed that the conversations were getting louder and there was more laughter. "Marge, you need to slow down. Don't forget you still have to go home," Susan said to her friend on the right. "No problem," answered Marge. Her face was now constantly flushed, and her eyes looked a little cloudy. "It's HHH, if I get too drunk to drive, I'll just ask that hot guy coming here to take me home." Susan followed Marge's finger and locked eyes with the fast-approaching handsome man she knew well, Tony, the same man she'd once been engaged to, who'd taken her virginity, and the one she'd sworn never to see again, who she had been waiting all day to hear from, and who was obviously heading towards the empty chair next to her. "Won't you hug your old friend?" Tony asked, taking her hands and pulling her to her feet. If her life depended on it, Susan would not have been able to explain why she stood up and hugged him. It wasn't just any cousin hug she really tried, but as soon as his arms wrapped around her waist, one of them came down on her ass and pulled her towards his bulging manhood. "Don't, I'm a married woman now," she whispered angrily and tried to pull away. Her friends looked at Tony the way cats look at a bowl of milk with complete adoration. She introduced him as an old friend from college, without specifying that his parents had moved here when they retired. Even she had to admit that he was a charming, attractive devil when he wanted to be, and from the looks on their faces, he could interest any of them if he wanted to. He seemed to be doing just that as he spent the next hour inviting each of them in turn, starting with Marge and moving around in a circle to dance with him. Susan had to admit that Tony had a special way with women. She sat there, watching him flirt with several of her friends on the dance floor until he was almost completely clothed, and jealousy began to rise in her mind. "Your turn," Tony finally said, taking her hand and leading her through the crowd. The band's lead singer did a good rendition of Tennessee Waltz, an old song much older than most of his audience, but this crowd of out-of-town rednecks and wannabe rednecks from the city hugged their partners affectionately and seemed to be having a good time. They started out modestly enough, but soon Tony pulled her closer, and she was too into it to resist. They stayed on the dance floor number after number, and although they started with a few inches of space between their bodies, they were soon pressed so tightly together that you couldn't fit a piece of paper between them. Finally, she insisted on returning to her friends. She didn't realize until later that she had completely forgotten her original purpose of being with Tony that evening. She never mentioned the past. Soon after returning to the table, she checked her watch and said, "It's time for me to leave." She knew that if she didn't leave Tony, she might do something she would regret. Maybe Fred won't be too tired when he comes home tonight because she needs good sex. "At least let me walk you to the car," Tony insisted, taking her hand tightly and heading towards the door. Before they had even gone halfway, Big John blocked their way. "Is everything all right here, Susan?" Big John was talking to Susan, but he put the evil eye on Tony, if that was possible. "Of course, John," Susan found herself answering. "Tony and I are old friends, and he just walks me to the car." "If you say so. Be sure to tell Fred I asked about him." He was still looking at Tony as he added, "That man is one of my favorite people. I'd hate for anything to happen to any of him." He continued to watch them until they disappeared around the corner of the building on their way to the back parking lot. "Brr." Tony seemed to shudder. "I wouldn't want to get on this man's bad side. Did you see how he caressed that whip? Dude, he touched that thing the way I touch a woman, remember?" Susan didn't answer, and they continued on their way to her car in silence. Upon reaching it, Tony surprised her by holding the door open like a gentleman, and the only thing he tried that could be considered taken away was a very chaste peck on her forehead as she turned to thank him. Tony smiled, remembering another time and another place as he watched her drive away. It was the night of their prom. Others went to Edisto Beach and a rental house where they planned to party until dawn. Tony didn't think he could get Susan to go all the way with others around, so he talked her into spending a private night at his father's fishing camp. Fish camp didn't do the hut justice. It was more like a country house by the river, with a well-stocked kitchen, comfortable furniture, and he made sure there were plenty of wines on hand. Hand in hand, they walked from the hut to a bench by the water, where they sat and silently listened to the duel of crickets with a night bird. Tony wasn't sure what kind of bird it was, but he recognized the distant sound of an owl. "My grandfather said that owl calls meant there were ghosts roaming the forest," Tony teased. "I don't believe in ghosts," she replied, but she still pressed herself tightly to him, so tightly that he felt her breasts pressed against his hot male body, and when he took her into his arms for a kiss, she did not protest. About neither shared a deep, passionate, tongue-exploring kiss that seemed to last forever. His right hand left the back of her head, where he had gently pressed her face to his and began to massage her breasts. She moaned. "It is so sweet." Tony could tell she was his if he didn't press too quickly. "Wow, that's really something, Susan, but I think we need to slow down a little. Let's go listen to some music. Maybe we'll dance." "That's how it's done, gentlemen," he said later, telling his friends his story of recklessness. After another glass of wine, they had already met a couple outside the gym. While the prom was in full swing, he turned on the phonograph and she stepped into his arms. They weren't really much of a dance. It was more of an exercise in dry sex in an upright position and fully clothed. Tony still remembered the feeling of her smooth buttocks as he lifted her dress and put his hands under her panties. Tony noticed that she didn't mind as he led her to the couch, large enough to take up most of the space on the west wall. He didn't even bother to throw the towels someone had left on the floor. If she was a virgin, which he was pretty sure she was, they might come in handy. His mouth left her only for a moment as she raised her arms so he could pull the dress over her head. It took him a few moments to gaze at her nearly naked beauty before his mouth captured her again. When he felt her fire burning properly, he quickly slipped out of his clothes. "It may hurt a little, but it won't last long. Ready?" Susan made an unintelligible sound that sounded something like, "For the first time, be gentle." Yes, Tony thought as her card disappeared from sight. "I'll definitely get this again, husband or no husband." She's even hotter now than she was in college. Fred usually didn't come home before Susan after her nights out with her girlfriends, but this time he had just gotten out of the shower when she walked into the bathroom. Without saying a word and clearly ignoring Fred, She took off her panties and threw them in the corner before sitting on the toilet. "This is really refreshing," she said, finally looking at her naked husband. Fred had just finished drying himself off and was still standing on the bath mat. On nights like this, when she and her friends had their parties, he was often rejected under some stupid excuse, so he didn't have high hopes. She playfully pushed his hand away when he tried to remove her clothes. Fred followed her hint to just lie back and enjoy the show while she did the dance for him. When she was completely undressed, he tried to take her into his arms again, only for her to shake her head no again. They were both panting as she rolled off his body, only to rest her head on his shoulder. After a busy day at work and an unexpected workout from Susan, Fred quickly fell asleep. He was so exhausted that he didn't even notice when Susan asked, "Did you like it?" She said Tony instead of Fred. Fred woke up late the next morning. It was a Saturday to the smell of bacon and eggs, and the sound of girls talking coming from the kitchen. "You're finally awake, sleepyhead." Susan greeted him with a big hug and a kiss on the cheek. "Don't forget, you promised to mow the grass and take the twins to their birthday and then to their mothers." "I'll take care of it. What else do you have planned for me?" "That's all, except we're meeting company at Big John's tonight." Every third Saturday, 3 couples met at Big John's for drinks, dancing, and food, not necessarily in that order. By 8 o'clock in the evening, all 6 friends were gathered at Big John's corner table, a table large enough for 8, but John always reserved it for them in case friends stopped by. Yes, it was wasteful in a way, but since Fred saved his skin, nothing had been too good for John. The dinner dishes were cleared away, fresh drinks were served, and a country band played "Somebody Done Somebody Wrong," while Fred watched several couples dancing. Since he was one of those unfortunates who are said to have 2 left feet, he envied the way men easily led their partners around the dance floor. Susan tried to teach him, but with limited success. Fred reluctantly followed Susan as she pulled him onto the dance floor, joining their friends who were already dancing. "Come on, baby, I need to burn dinner," she said. After they did the line dance not too badly, they switched to a slow romantic number. "Sorry," Fred said, stepping on her foot twice in as many minutes. He tried, he really did, but he just couldn't master it. He understood how upset Susan was at his inability to share her passion for dancing, so he encouraged her to accept invitations to dance from other men, but these men were usually from their wide circle of friends. It was just pure fun. But something changed that night, and Fred wasn't sure what it was. They had just returned to their seats after Susan had complained that she was tired when a man Fred didn't know approached. He could describe it as handsome, but it reminded him of a rattlesnake. Fred knew that this stranger was going to ask Susan to dance, and he was sure that Susan would refuse him. "May I ask you to dance, fair lady?" The stranger smiled at Susan and extended his hand. "Of course," she replied. Fred was shocked to see Susan jump up and follow the stranger without giving him a glance. He didn't mind his wife dancing with other men, but at least she could have at least pretended to ask his permission before dancing with a stranger. Besides, what happened to the fact that she was tired? Susan watched Tony approach. "Oh damn," she thought, "what is he going to do now?" She hoped he wouldn't reveal their previous relationship before she could tell Fred who he was. She needn't have worried. Tony was completely ignoring Fred, as if he wasn't there. One quick glance at Fred's face told her that he had noticed the slight. Susan couldn't explain her next actions if her life depended on it. Tony's dazzling smile, his boyish look and general attitude that he knew what he wanted and would make it clear that nothing would stop him. It all must have worked some magic, because the next thing she knew, that she was following him, her heart was beating the same way as on their first date once upon a time. Tony was a much better dancer than Fred. Susan lost track of how many numbers they danced every time someone tried to barge in. Tony either ignored them or growled at them to leave. Susan felt like she could spend the rest of the evening cuddled up to Tony. "I need to get back to our table," she finally insisted when she actually saw how Fred was taking it. "Just one," Tony coaxed. "One dance won't hurt." Susan almost agreed, but then looked back at her husband. Things weren't going well at home. "No," she said, "no more. In fact, we've already done too much." She walked towards their table and whispered, hoping Tony would hear, "If you don't come with me and if you behave like a gentleman, this may be our last meeting." Tony walked ahead of Susan as they approached the table and deftly seated her, so that she was one seat away from her previous chair, while he sat down between Susan and her husband. "I'm Tony," she heard him introduce himself, extending his hand and continuing, "Your wife is a wonderful dancer, and I thank you very much for allowing me to spend so much time with her that should have been yours." Susan watched Fred's expression closely. How he reacted in the next few minutes could decide whether she could remain friends with Tony or whether she would never see him again. She wasn't sure why it meant so much to her. She definitely wasn't going to do anything other than flirt, like she and the other wives did with each other's husbands. Since he was really a good dancer, she would like to have such a relationship with him. If only Fred could understand what a good person Tony is, they could date sometimes. Otherwise, it wouldn't do because she didn't intend to upset her husband. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her chest when she saw Fred shake Tony's hand and say, "Oh, damn, it's just a dance, she loves it, and I can't satisfy her in that regard, so let it be." Susan breathed a sigh of relief, but she didn't miss the look on Fred's face when he turned to her and said, "We'll talk about this at home." "Who the hell is this guy?" Fred asked as soon as they left the parking lot. "He's just an old friend, a very good old friend from before you and I met." Fred accepted her answer, but he had a nagging feeling that she wasn't telling him everything. "Yes, judging by the way you hugged, he really was a very good friend." "Oh, that's just Tony's way. He didn't mean anything by it." "A blind man would have seen that this bastard was hot towards you tonight." Fred wondered how his wife couldn't see it. "Well, I'm coming home with you, aren't I?" Susan stroked his thigh as she spoke. "I can't control his feelings for me now, but if you don't want to, I won't communicate with him." They were silent most of the way home. When Fred parked in the garage and turned off the engine, they continued to sit. It seemed like they were having a hard time getting out of the car before they solved the problem. Fred began, but Susan interrupted him. "Look, Fred, maybe Tony was a little more than just a good friend back in the day. He was actually the guy I was engaged to before we broke up." Susan hugged her husband tightly as she spoke. "But darling, you have to trust me. All this is in the past. You are the one I love and with whom I plan to spend the rest of my life. Yes, I love talking to Tony, and yes, he is a very good dancer, but that's it. It all ends. Just say the word and I won't talk to him anymore." "I don't think we need to get to that point." Fred felt that he was in a difficult situation. He did not want to be unreasonable, and more than anything he wanted Susan to be happy and content, but he did not want other men to touch her buttocks. This was supposed to be his personal territory now. "Okay, I guess since you put it that way, it would be unreasonable to demand that you not talk to your friends, but I don't have to tell you that talking is the most you can hope for, okay?" "Agreed. Now let's go into the house so we can seal this agreement with something I've been needing all evening." Susan walked towards the house, but waited until he opened the door. Their clothes disappeared in a flurry of activity, which they would later find strewn from the front door to the bedroom. When the afterglow passed, Fred couldn't keep his mouth shut. "Was it as good as he did when you two were dating?" Susan rolled over to kiss him on the lips. "Don't, honey. Let old dogs stay dead. Just know that sex with you is always wonderful, and you are the man I love, the father of my children." "Oh shit," thought Fred, "that means he was better than me." While Susan slept the sleep of the righteous, Fred lay imagining Tony between his wife's legs. Even when he finally dozed off, his dreams were of Susan screaming in pleasure while some stranger had sex with her. It's good that the next day was Sunday. He finally fell into a deep sleep and did not wake up until church time had passed. He decided to go for a run instead because he no longer had time for church. Susan woke up this Sunday to an eerily quiet house. "Where is everyone?" It took her a few minutes to realize it was Sunday. Crap, I was late for work. Jumping up and grabbing her clothes, she hurriedly tried to pull them on when she finally realized what time it was. To hell, she muttered, I could use some silence. After making a cup of coffee, she sat down and, looking at the birds fluttering in the bushes outside the panoramic window, thought about Fred's question and her answer. Could she really say that Tony was a better lover? Hardly. But he was different. With Fred, love was always tender and affectionate, while with Tony, sex was usually a wild ride on an indomitable Mustang. After Fred, she realized that wild sex wasn't something she wanted on a regular basis, but she had to admit that sometimes it would be nice for a change. She remembered some of the stories she and Fred had read on Literotica, the ones where the husband gave his wife permission to cheat. No, get those thoughts out of your head, girl. There's no way Fred would do that, and if the roles were reversed, you wouldn't agree either. She continued to argue with herself about the possibility of permissions like those in LW's section on Lit. After Fred went for a run and the kids returned from church with their grandparents, they all went out for pizza and a movie. Back home, finally putting the kids to bed, they had a night of very satisfying sex. Then everything in the Parker family returned to normal. The only irritating factor was the flowers that Susan continued to receive at work without any cards or notes. She was confused. She didn't know who exactly she should thank. At first, she thought it was Tony, but then she remembered an incident several years ago when the same thing happened. She received bouquet after bouquet for 5 days in a row without a single note. Finally, on the last day, Friday, there was a card with a simple message. You have a reservation at Smokey's Steakhouse at 7 p.m. Be there. Dress smartly. By then, the temptation was too great. She was 99% sure that Fred was her unknown admirer, but she needed to find out for sure. Having arrived a little early, she continued to argue with herself while she waited. Should she be here or not? What would she do if it weren't Fred? The first sign that she had company was a man's hands on her shoulders and lips kissing her neck. She almost jumped, as her mother said. Luckily, she recognized Fred's cologne before she screamed. I've never been so glad to see you, darling, she said as his lips moved from her neck to hers. As he promised, they had a wonderful time, and the sex sparked for weeks. Susan hoped it was Fred this time, too, because if it was Tony and Fred found out, the situation could get tense. Later, perhaps, when Fred met Tony and realized what a great guy he was, everything could change, but not now. Tony, oddly enough, was thinking the same thing. He still hadn't given up trying to get Susan, but he was beginning to realize that it would be a long road. That's when he stopped giving flowers. It was becoming too expensive, and took a different approach. He began working on getting to know Fred better, joined the same gym, started going bowling on the same day as Fred, and even convinced some of the kids to invite him fishing. This fishing trip allowed Tony to spend a 3-day weekend in a double cabin with Fred. Tony could be very charming when he wanted to be, and gradually his charm lessened Fred's suspicions. Tony never talked about his many conquests, as was common among others on these fishing trips, and neither did Fred. From some of the comments Fred made, Tony knew that it earned him points in Fred's eyes. How was Susan at work? Knowing her, I'm sure your wife is an excellent salesman. Tony finally decided to try to make Fred feel comfortable with the idea that Susan knew him. When we were in college, you should have seen her working sorority fundraisers. Damn it. This girl was something. She once raised more money than everyone else put together. Yes, she is still good. Sometimes I even think that maybe she shouldn't be so good. They sat in the boat, trying to catch the bream with crickets, which they cast under the willows. Suddenly Fred's float plunged under the water, and his cane bent almost in half, and began to zigzag as Mr. Bushbrema protested against leaving his favorite spot. Why do you say that? Tony asked. She started working a few hours a week to avoid getting bored. One sale led to another, and now she works almost as many hours as I do. It really interferes with family life. Fred continued talking and pulling out fish. He was excited about its size. Tony was excited too. He felt like he had just caught an even bigger fish. Fred's tone said he wasn't getting the sex he wanted, and he would bet that meant Susan wasn't getting it either. They wouldn't be the first couple to lose sight of the importance of sex in a happy marriage. It was a chink in the marriage armor, and Tony was exactly the guy who could crawl through it. Before any of them realize what happened, Tony will find himself between her supposedly happily married legs. She works at Low Country Realty, doesn't she? I need a job and I have a license. Do you think they could take on another agent to lighten the load? I hope so. I'd love to come home to a home-cooked meal rather than having to cook for myself or order takeaway 4 times a week. I know the owner. He's an old hunting buddy. I'll put in a good word for you as soon as we get back. Her husband had just given him the key to Susan, and he didn't even know it. Fred kept his promise. By the middle of the next week, not only was Tony working in the Low Country, but Susan had also been appointed as his probationary mentor. For a month, his goal was to stay close to Susan and learn everything he could from her. Life couldn't have been better for Tony. Susan saw the assignment to work with Tony as good news, bad news. "Yes, sir, I will be happy to show Tony everything he needs," she answered when her boss asked if she was ready to help their new agent. "Have you two met yet?" It was not for nothing that the boss took this position. He didn't miss the look that Susan and Tony exchanged. "Yes, sir, I have already met Mr. Jackson. We went to college together." When she was dating Tony, he was in many ways, it could have been stopped up to a certain point. After this moment, say, stop. It was no use because he had no intention of stopping. The problem was that it was impossible to know exactly when this moment occurred. Standing in her boss's office, she could feel herself blushing just thinking about it. Yes, the coming days will be interesting, she thought. The next 4 weeks were really interesting. Tony and Susan spent at least 6 hours a day together, much of it in the field, preparing contractors' homes for sale or showing those that were ready. Day after day, Tony destroyed her doubts. The diners, at first separated on opposite sides of the booth, then moved to sitting on one side, his hand touching her bare skin at every opportunity. Added to this were cute jokes that gradually became more and more risque, and of course, the old seducer's trick of always bringing up topics on which Fred disagreed with her, which could be anything from the music they listened to the films that they loved to watch. Of course, every time the topic came up, Tony simply enjoyed it, and whenever she complained about something Fred did, he quickly assured Susan that if she were his, he would never do that to her. Tony also made it a habit to wear cowboy clothes whenever the company allowed, which was on casual Fridays and occasionally on other special days, especially those spent mostly in the fields. Every time he looked in the mirror, he recognized that his skinny jeans showed off his not-so-small package in all its glory. Moreover, he often caught Susan checking up on Mr. D's Lucky, as they called him in the old days. He managed to touch her breasts, play with her ears, rub her back, and even kiss her cheeks. It was all completely innocent, of course, but each touch was a step in the direction he was leading her in, and not once did he feel that she wanted him to stop. Finally, the day he decided to go all in. They had an early showing of the River House, and the potential buyer fell in love with it at first sight. They signed a purchase option form for an amount that was very beneficial to both the seller and the agents. The buyer may not have gained much, but he was happy, and the coastal real estate wasn't all that plentiful. "You know what?" Tony held her face in his hands as he spoke. "Let's say we're working on this deal, that we have almost reached an agreement, but we need a little more time to have dinner with the buyer, and by the end of the working day, we will have a signed contract. This way, we'll have the whole day to ourselves." "You're so bad," Susan said, punching him lightly in the chest. "But why not? We deserve a break." "Yes, we deserve it. Let's go back to that corner store we passed on the way here and buy something for a picnic. There, on the riverbank, about 100 feet from here, is the perfect place for it." A little over an hour later, they were sitting on a blanket that Tony always seemed to keep in his car, enjoying the sights and sounds of nature while relaxing after a good snack. Tony took action when he saw Susan lean back and relax with her eyes closed. His mouth touched hers. Alarmed, she tried to break free at first, but Tony held her tightly, and she stopped resisting. Susan fell into a deep sleep and dreamed about the time she and Tony made love. She dreamed that he was kissing her, and she answered him. When suddenly she woke up, he really kissed her. No, her mind screamed, I can't do this, I'm married. She tried to break free, but Tony wasn't about to let her go, and to be honest, she didn't put up much of a fight. Tony had always been a great lover, and within seconds she had completely forgotten about pulling out. She realized his hands were under her top, trying to massage her breasts through her bra, and she knew she should stop him, but it felt so good, and it had been days since Fred had shown any interest in sex. No, we can't do that. I'm married, she protested, but not too forcefully. Do you remember the first time we did this? Tony's voice was as smooth as silk. Remember how much you liked it. I remember the first time it hurt, and it wasn't pleasant at all. It felt like you were tearing me in half. She tried to break away from him, but to no avail. Yeah, that was the first time, but what about later? After we've done it a few times, remember how good it was? All this time, while he was talking, he was trying to unfasten her bra, and finally he succeeded. Susan felt her breasts release their restrictions. They moved on to a long, slow jog across the plains of love before finally breaking into a wild gallop that ended with them lying side by side, exhausted and sweaty. He wanted a second round, but then he looked at his watch. My God, he said, shaking Susan, it's time for us to leave here. She glanced at her watch and instantly woke up. I can't let Fred see me like this, she said, gathering up her scattered clothes. She nervously tossed around and even put her top on inside out, which only proved that if you rush, you'll make people laugh. Tony got dressed faster and tried to adjust her clothes while she pulled them on. He didn't want Fred to suspect. The last thing he needed was a damn jealous redneck with a gun looking for him. Where is she? Fred checked the driveway for the third time in the last 5 minutes. Did she really forget about our anniversary? Every year they would have dinner and watch the newest movie on this special day. This year he rented the movie they both wanted to see, so they could cuddle on the couch and do other things that might come up. Yes, I know it's corny, but we've been doing this for so long that it's like a tradition. He made another circle around the room, stopping to once again make sure that the diamond necklace he had been saving for so long was still hidden on the top shelf of the bookcase. He planned to give it to her after returning from dinner. At this point, she will already be sure that he has again settled on the boring, same as always for their anniversary, so the necklace was supposed to be a real surprise. No, she still hasn't returned, he muttered. Where could she be? Finally, he gave up and went to the toilet to relieve himself, and when he re-entered the living room, Susan was just closing the door. Where have you been, darling? Things at work just got crazy. I think time just flew by. Fred walked up to her and, firmly taking her by the shoulders, turned her around. Her unkempt clothes did not escape his attention. Yes, I see that it was so. I don't think I've ever seen you come home from work looking like this. I know. We had to urgently clean one place that we should show tomorrow. Her face turned red. She couldn't look him in the eye as she tried to walk past him. Sorry, I really need to clean myself up. Have you forgotten what day it is? What do you mean? What day is it? Crap, I can't believe you forgot our anniversary. Oh my God, Susan put her hand to her mouth. Sorry, dear, I completely forgot. Let me change, it'll only take a few minutes. Fred noticed that she turned away when he tried to kiss her, but not before he caught the scent of her breath. He couldn't place his finger on the slightly musky scent. He continued to think about it as she rushed to the bathroom. True to her word, she left the bathroom and got dressed in record time. Nothing gave Fred more pleasure than watching her get dressed well, almost nothing, so he stood quietly to the side and watched her pull on that little black dress that was quite short. Fred stood there until any skin that wasn't supposed to be on display all night was covered, and then he went into the bathroom to relieve his nervous bubble. That's when his world began to crumble. Susan was usually a tidy person, but this evening she was in such a hurry that she threw her dirty clothes on the floor instead of in the hamper, and right on top were her panties. It took all of his self-control to keep a calm face as he rejoined Susan. "Is something wrong, dear?" Maybe he wasn't hiding his face that well. "No, I guess I was just thinking about how much fun we'd have once we got home." Susan continued to glance at her husband during a trip to the Silver Slipper, one of the best clubs in the city. She wouldn't be surprised if he made a reservation at Big John's. Instead, he chose a place with a really good band. She was surprised that he would expose her to temptation by allowing her to dance with men who were not their mutual friends. He certainly had no idea what she was doing that day. If he had known, he would never have chosen a place like the Shoe. It was a pleasant evening. The delicious steak was even tastier than the one they ate on their honeymoon, and the band devoted the entire evening to golden hits from the Glenn Miller era, so there were plenty of slow romantic numbers for Fred to dance well to. In fact, only 3 times had she accepted another man's invitation to dance, and she had made sure that all 3 were old enough that Fred couldn't be jealous. As she pressed herself against him, her arms wrapped around his neck, she could feel his arousal. She began to think that maybe she was just imagining something was bothering Fred. Overall, she was a contented woman as she snuggled under his right arm on the way home. Thank God Fred insisted on keeping that old Lincoln. It would be impossible to snuggle up in her brand new Ford minivan, which didn't have bench seats. She was still confused that Fred never tried to grope her like he usually did. One thing was clear: she was going to tell Tony that their little affair was over. The next decision was whether to confess everything to Fred. Recalling one entry in an old love advice column, maybe it was "Dear Abby," but she wasn't sure. In any case, when the woman was asked if she should confess her affair to her husband, the columnist replied, "No, this will only ease your conscience at the expense of destroying your husband's self-esteem. Instead, you must remain faithful from now on and be the best wife you can be." Susan was relieved when she decided to follow this advice. "Yes, I will. It was a one-time affair, no more infidelity for this girl. Even flirting, and tonight I'm going to make love to Fred like never before." Fred walked his wife into the house as usual. The difference was that helped her to the kitchen and not to the sofa in front of the TV, as he would have done if they were going to watch a regular movie. "Would you like some coffee? He has already started making coffee in the coffee maker." "Sure, why not?" Susan came closer and ran her fingers along his neck. "I have a feeling we're going to bed late tonight." Fred looked at her for a moment. Did she understand that he guessed about her betrayal? "I'll go to the bathroom while the coffee brews." He left before she could respond. When he returned, he saw Susan pouring them both a cup of aromatic drink. He sat down at the kitchen bar across from her. After a moment's hesitation, while they both took a few sips of coffee, Fred took her hands. Looking into her eyes, he began the conversation he had been dreading. "Susan, do you have something you want to tell me?" She looked away, fidgeted on the stool, then replied, "Nothing, except that I love you very much." "Why do you ask?" "I was just thinking about this evening." "Why? What do you mean about this evening? What's wrong with him?" She decided that the best defense was an attack. "You know, you came home late and everything, and then you avoided me like the plague. You don't usually do that. I told you when I got home that I had a very busy day. That's all. God, you think I committed a crime? I was just a few minutes late. I forgot. Okay." Her cheeks turned bright red, as they always did when she lied. She had a built-in lie detector and had never realized it in their entire married life. It was almost too easy. "So this has nothing to do with this." Fred pulled the panties out of his pocket and threw them in front of her. "Oh, no, 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 no." Fred had to grab her hand to keep her from fainting. He managed to get her to sit on the floor and bring a damp cloth for her forehead. He gently patted her face until her eyes opened. Her pale face, with an expression of pure horror, decided the question of how he would handle this situation. He wasn't going to let some bastard ruin his marriage, not if he could help it. Susan had to pay, but he wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The problem was that he had no intention of being a submissive cuckold. No, she had to pay, but he would never kick her out, at least not because of one small incident. The problem was, what would be an appropriate punishment? He had time to think about it. However, now he had a wife to take care of, albeit a lost wife. But damn it, she was his wife, and in his opinion, love could not be turned on and off like a faucet. Sorry, sorry, I love you. She continued to mumble as he helped her undress and laid her under the sheet. Hush, it's okay. We'll talk about it in the morning. Fred calmed her down as he took off his clothes. She didn't calm down until he lay down next to her. Pulling her almost naked body to his completely naked one, he laid her head on his shoulder, and she finally calmed down and fell asleep. She could fall asleep, but Fred could not fall asleep for a long time, planning his further actions. The first item on the agenda was the name of the bastard who didn't respect him enough to screw his wife. It didn't matter that his wife was a willing participant to Fred she had to pay, but the bastard who did this to his marriage had a completely different score, and Fred was damn sure that he would pay it in full. Fred was waiting for her in the kitchen with coffee and pancakes when Susan finally came out. Hello, sunshine. His attempt to sound normal failed even to his ears. You look like you were dragged in by a cat. She seemed to be looking at him with one eye while the other was searching for something on the table. Of course, it was impossible, but that's what it looked like to Fred. Finally, having made the coffee just the way she liked it, she said, "Please tell me last night was just a bad dream." It was a bad dream, of course a real nightmare, and I feel that for you it is not over yet. You have a lot of explanations, and you can start while we eat. About? Yes, I have questions, and you better have the answers. It doesn't matter to me if your answers hurt, as long as they are truthful. Remember, I already know a lot, and if I catch you lying, we're done. I owe you the truth, at least that much. She took a bite of her pancakes and took a long sip of coffee. Ask your questions, I'll try to answer them if I can. Who did you sleep with last night? With Tony. Your old boyfriend, the one you assured me was only interested in as a dance partner? Fred jumped up and walked to the window, absently looking at the cardinals fluttering in the bushes outside the window. Finally, exhaling, he turned and asked, "Why, Susan, why would you give up everything we've built over the years? Is he that much better in bed? Tell me, Susan, why did you do this?" Susan cringed for a moment at his scream, but quickly pulled herself together. Taking another sip of coffee, she replied, "This is not a simple question. An explanation is required." Let's. I told you I broke off my engagement with Tony, right? Continue. Well, that's not entirely true. He broke up with me. I was furious and swore I never wanted to see him again. You and I met, and I fell madly in love with you, and it's true. To be honest, I almost never thought about it, and if I did, it was a toothache. But then he showed up here in town and joined our circle of friends. He even started working in the office, where he was so charming that I again began to forget about old problems and fall under his spell. You love him? No, I don't like him, but I like him, or rather, I liked him. Now, in the light of day, I realize that he is the same playboy he always was. He just wanted to get me into bed, and I fell for his game. Susan took his hands in hers. Please forgive me, Fred. Tears streamed down her cheeks. If you can forgive me, I will do everything so that you never regret it, dear. Fred had decided last night that he wasn't going to give up his wife without a fight, but there was no point in showing his cards too soon. You damn well better not do that. He growled, and then, having finished breakfast and drunk a second cup of coffee, he continued to interrogate her and had to admit that her answers sounded sincere. Finally satisfied with her answers, he moved away from the table. I need to think, he announced. I'm going for a long walk, and maybe I'll stop by Big John's later if you need anything. It was almost lunchtime when Fred walked through Big John's door. As he walked, his rage visibly subsided, and he remembered his Sunday school lesson on the Lord's Prayer, especially the part about asking God to "Forgive me as I forgive others." Forgiving will be easy, forgetting will be hell, but until Susan gave him more reason to make him doubt her, he was not going to throw away the best thing in his life because of wounded pride. Hell, he even let that bastard Tony get away as long as he stayed away from his woman and kept his mouth shut. Until that bastard talks, very few people will know that Susan slept with him. His calm mood, despite all his good intentions, did not last long enough for him to make it to the bar. The sight of Tony sitting on the court with a bunch of idiots just pissed him off. John rushed to meet him with his favorite beer in his hand and pulled him to the corner table before he could walk 10 feet through the door. "We have a problem, Fred," John said, pushing him into a chair. This little guy was much stronger than Fred could have imagined. "What do you mean we're in trouble? I didn't think I did anything to make you angry." "You know better, man. I'm talking about what this asshole says about Susan." John continued to tell Fred about how Tony had bragged about sleeping with Susan. Before he could finish, John had to physically restrain Fred, and this naturally caught the attention of Tony and his posse, who decided it would be a good idea to make a book about the little guy holding down the cuckold. "Don't be a damn fool," John muttered quietly enough for their tormentors not to hear. "Go there, and it will be a fight, so when they get what they deserve, you'll be the first one the cops are looking for. Now sit down and let's talk." John then pointed to the 2 walking tanks known as bouncers that were always by his side. Fred watched with pleasure as his tormentors' boots barely touched the floor as they literally dragged him to the door by his collars. When Fred left the bar a little over an hour later, plans were in place, and he was fully aware of the benefits of having friends in low places. He'll handle the home front, and John will take care of the collateral damage. When he walked through his door, he was greeted by a very upset Susan. She looked barely able to keep the situation under control. "What's happened?" he asked. "I just hung up on Tony. He wanted me to meet him again. He said that if I didn't do it, he would spread the word about what we did throughout the office and the church." "What did you tell him?" "That I was going to talk to you about it before I gave him an answer." "What did he say?" "He said not to worry about the cuck. He'll take care of it." She clung to Fred, sobbing. "He will destroy us. I will be the laughing stock of society. I don't want his dirty hands to ever touch me again, but what will I do?" Fred considered his answer for a minute before picking up the phone and dialing the number. He entered another room and closed the door. When he returned, he said, "Call back and tell him I'll meet you in White Bluff at 11 o'clock tonight. If he wants to know why it's so late, tell him you need to let me sleep before you can." White Bluff was a favorite kissing spot among schoolchildren. Susan wondered if Fred would really forgive her that easily, but she didn't want to question the good things. When Fred finally stood up, he playfully spanked her ass before dragging her to the bedroom. "We need to hurry up and get dressed. We have a big night ahead of us." He kissed her before pushing her into the shower. "You go first while I shave." He definitely acts like he really forgives me. I just hope Tony has the good sense to stay away. Just enough for Fred to see him trying to hit on me again without predicting what would happen. Susan was a little embarrassed when Fred started to put on his suit. She was sure that going to Charleston was actually code for doing the Charleston on Tony's corpse, but here he was wearing his best suit. "Are we really going to Charleston?" "Yes, it really is, so shake your bones and do something that will make me the envy of every man." When he opened the car door, she made sure to show him as much leg as possible while she sat down, and when she sat down, she arranged for her hem to rise almost high enough for him to check the color of her underwear. When they were almost an hour away, Susan asked if they could talk. "Certainly. What's on your mind?" "Why aren't you mad at me? I expected you to spit your nails." "Will anything help if I'm still cursing and raving? Will that stop you from ever doing it again?" "Actually, I think it's better not to behave like that. I see you like this. You know you're hurt, and yet you're willing to forgive me, and it makes me feel like a dog. I never want to hurt you again. If you don't mind, I have one more question. Will Tony receive the same forgiveness as I did?" "He received. I decided to turn the other cheek, as the Holy Scriptures say, but before we could discuss it, old Tony managed to hit me on the other cheek. Scripture doesn't tell me what to do then, so I just go with my instincts." Susan considered his answer. Finally, she said, "You're not going to tell me what you're going to do, are you?" "No, only on the basis of necessity. You don't have to know, but I assure you that you don't want to find out the hard way. Just remember that I love you. My friends don't necessarily feel the same way." They had a great time. The fine show was followed by a late dinner and then dancing, or at least what could be called dancing, at the Henderson house on James Street. Susan noticed that Fred had spoken to about a dozen people throughout the evening. This was very unusual for him. He was usually quiet, and she was talkative. Returning home, she was already dreaming of finally lying between the sheets and resting when she felt his hands clasping her breasts. "Do you really want it again? I can't allow you to remain unsatisfied. You can't predict what such a beautiful woman might do if she starts to desire." She laid her head on his shoulder and fell asleep, thinking about how happy she was. The next day, Fred arrived home before her and was preparing dinner when his wife burst into the house, obviously excited but also worried. "What's happened?" asked Fred. "Didn't you watch the news?" "No. Tell." "Tony was found on a country road about 5 miles out of town this morning. He was severely beaten. I heard 2 guys from work say that the doctors said he would probably be impotent when he left the hospital." She was about to change into something comfortable when she suddenly stopped and looked at him. "You have nothing to do with this, do you?" "How could I? We were together all night, and if I understand you correctly, he should have been beaten last night. So what do you think?" "Honestly, I don't know, but I think you're a dangerous person who you shouldn't mess with." She walked towards him, pressing herself against his body. 30 years and 3 more children later, Fred and Susan were still a loving couple. Where there was one, there was usually another. Tony stayed in town, but he and Susan avoided each other like the plague. It was so obvious that when one of Susan's friends asked Susan why she and Tony were trying so hard to avoid each other, she replied, "My husband has friends in low places. You never know who might get the wrong idea, so I don't tempt fate." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.